This podcast is a Jeff Townsend Media production.
This is Jeff Townsend. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Indiana Stories. This is Jeff Townsend, and we are here for another episode of Indiana Stories. I hope you all are doing well and enjoying the podcast so far. We're going to start off where we left off last episode, where I was talking to the Murder Sheet podcast, Anya Kane and Kevin Greenlee. We left off at a point where we were talking about profiling of criminal cases and stuff like that. So we're going to jump back into that today. And of course, it's absolutely critical that this case gets solved. So we're doing our part, trying to spread the word. If you want to reach out and communicate with the podcast, you can contact me at jeff@townsend.media. That's the email. There's also indianastories@gmail.com. I have that open as well. And you can also find a contact page on indianastories.com. Before we jump into this and finish up the conversation that I started last episode, I want to thank Podcast Page, Podden.io, and Boomcaster, all tools that I use to make this podcast. They're all great supporters of this podcast and all my other content. I'm not just saying that because I have a working relationship with them. I really mean it. It's the best stuff I've ever used. All right, let's get into this conversation again, and we'll pick up where we left off with Kevin Greenlee and Anya Kane, the murder sheet, the Delphi case.
I think a lot of this is like they don't want to release anything that could harm the case. And I imagine an incorrect profile would be pretty devastating. And it wouldn't necessarily give the public a ton to go off of because we're looking for a violent, bad person. Yes, that makes sense. I think that's not that surprising. And also, I don't think they had the sense that this was necessarily a series of crimes from what we understand. So it's not like they necessarily wanted people making connections to other cases.
But people were, though. Different states like Iowa. I mean, there were, I don't remember, but there were a lot of connections being made because the can of worms was so big on the possibility of the suspect. Like we said before, it led to people making assumptions. 2022 has been a big year for this case. And I'll let you talk about. So there's a lot that happened over the last couple of years that we didn't hear about. But as you said, stuff was still happening, but we start hearing about it this year.
Yes. Back in 2020, Kagan Klein, the man whose home was searched shortly after the murders, was arrested and charged with multiple counts related to child sexual abuse materials. And right after he was arrested, the police sat down with him and had an interview/interrogation with him that the printed transcript of that runs to 190 pages. I'll get back to that in a moment. Subsequently, in December of 2021, on December 6, 2021, the police released a video in which they revealed that they were interested in getting information about a computer social profile in the name of Anthony Schatz. And the next day, it was revealed by Demi Johnson, who's a reporter for Wish TV here in Indianapolis at the time, that that profile was maintained by Kagan Klein.
What we learned when we obtained the police transcript of the interrogation through a clerical error, actually, was that basically police back in 2020 confronted Kagan with the fact that the Anthony Schatz account was in direct contact with Liberty German, one of the two victims.
It was in contact with her as late as the morning of the murders.
And that there were plans seemingly that were discussed about, in terms of later on after the girls had disappeared or had been murdered, actually, the Anthony Schatz account was in contact with one of Libby's friends. And the friend said, "Oh, have you heard what happened? This is awful." And it's paraphrasing, but the account said something back like, "No, we were supposed to meet today, but she never showed up." And then, Libby's friends telling police that she was enthralled by this account. She wanted to meet this account, believing that the account was run by a 19-year-old who was closer to her age, obviously, and sort of had cultivated an image of a handsome and wealthy young person who might be romantically interested in Libby. So catfishing, essentially.
Yes.
And so the what we released kind of really, I think, ended up changing a lot of perspectives on the case, in that it kind of gave a sense of not speculation, but here's what police have actually been doing all this time and what is rising to the surface of credible leads, essentially.
Yeah. So you guys are really focused in on this. I've listened to a guy on YouTube that's just interesting guy. He's hell-strung that this was the owner of the property is he is the killer. But you guys, and I'm not saying that, I'm not going to just say you guys think he's the killer, but you think this is where the focus really truly is with this?
Yes.
Yeah, it's fair to say that we really don't think people are super interested in our opinions of what we think. We think what people care about is, what do the police think? What do the investigators think? Who are they looking at? What suspects do they consider to be most intriguing? And all of the sources we've developed have indicated strongly that the Klein lead is where police are focused.
We don't have a dog in the race or whatever. I mean, we don't care in terms of, people become very territorial about their person of interest, so to speak. And that's not journalism. It's not journalism to be emotionally invested in one outcome or another. It's fine to have opinions and think, okay, this is more credible than that. But I think when people get emotionally invested and start arguing with each other online about whose suspect is better, that doesn't really serve the case. What serves the case is knowing what the police are doing, knowing where the direction is heading, and looking at the evidence as it is. And the evidence as it stands is a known internet predator was in direct contact with a underage murder victim who at the very least was strongly interested in meeting with said person at some point. So I think that sort of...
And you say known predator, this is to a significant, that does not explain how significant of a predator or the charges that he's had upon him and facing. They called it one of the largest. I don't want to quote it wrong, but they made, what comment did they make about the scale of the?
They basically one of the detectives in the interrogation said something to the effect of, our investigation into your devices has led to one of the biggest child sexual abuse materials investigation in Indiana history. The caveat is that police can lie in interrogations. Yeah. So we're not necessarily saying that that's a known fact, but it's if true, it's certainly very indicative of something. And we, it's certainly, we know that online predators, people who commit sexual crimes against children on the internet, they can operate in conjunction with one another where they're trading materials, basically. And it's like a, there's these exchanges, and there's almost a community, underground community that gets up to these really heinous crimes together.
We know that through the interrogation, we assume that he had several accounts. So this was an elaborate catfishing. He was goading them with another account, pretending to be a girl. And he was doing this and that. We don't even know how many accounts he had. It's probably more than we even know, in my opinion, but that's my opinion, doesn't matter. So just to paint the picture there, he had been doing this for a while, and it wasn't just some nonchalant catfishing. It was very elaborate, and there was a lot put behind it, a lot of time, a lot of effort on his end.
Yes. And Kagan Klein also, we established through interviewing family members, through interviewing friends of his, people who knew him. He had a very elaborate fantasy life, to say the least. He would lie about everything from what kind of cool job he had or where he was living. He claimed at one point to be living in Las Vegas and made a lot of people who knew him think he was living in Las Vegas, but he wasn't. And I think, when you have somebody who has such a dark secret on their devices, it maybe makes a little bit of sense when you have them kind of constructing this facade of being, a table game dealer in Vegas, when the reality is they're still living at their parents' house in Indiana, and they have all of their devices are chock full of really sick images of children.
And just to sum up what I took away from a little bit from the interrogation, they really set the stage on that first half of it with all the things that we're talking about right now. Before they came in with the unfortunate Delphi situation, they set the stage for him with everything else they had. Then they said, hey, to kind of end it all, they said, this is what we think and we want information on it.
Yeah. Yeah. Kevin and I both felt it was a skillful interrogation. It wasn't relying on aggression or anything like that. It was just sort of like, we will give you all the facts we have and let you know how ridiculous we think your excuses are. Kagan Klein maintained his innocence for most of it. He admitted to some things in the interview, but otherwise he started talking about how his friend must have taken his phone whenever he passed out and put a bunch of child sexual abuse materials on it, which,
they proved, or they thought that through the way the messages were sent, that, how they can analyze the words and verbiage and all that there was more than one person sending them, correct? That's what they led to. That's what they're saying in that interrogation.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. For instance, Anya and I share an email account. And if somebody were to look at all the emails that come from that account, you could probably tell, or this person uses a lot of emojis and a lot of exclamation
points. That's you too, Kevin, right? Other emojis.
But this other person doesn't write that way. Yeah. And so you can tell that, these messages seem to be written by two different people. And people who were analyzing the messages sent from the Anthony Shots social media accounts could tell there were cues and clues that they were written by two people. And so the question becomes, who's that second person?
Yes. And the police were very specific that they believed the second person was also spending a lot of time in the Peru residence. So not somebody who hacked in from across the world, who was, fooling around with it as well, but somebody else in the proximity.
And not somebody who would just come over for a beer an hour.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You guys did an amazing job with that. Then we'll kind of sum this up with everything that's the domino effect since that was the transcript of that was released. A lot of things have come to light since then that may or may not be significant. Sure seems like it, but I'll let you walk through that before we sum it up, because that kind of caused a domino effect, like I said.
Yeah, we certainly feel like at least it spurred some understanding among the public about what was happening and maybe broke a bit of the wall of silence that's existed in the case for so long.
I want to bring up one thing. I'm sorry. And I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
So we discovered that they maybe had been spending a lot of time on a wrong lead. I'm sorry, Anya. I love you. I didn't mean to cut you off. I just wanted to make sure I get that in here, because from what we're reading, it sounds like they're not admittedly saying it, but kind of like they acknowledge like, hey, we went the wrong way. Now we're pivoting this way. What was it that caused them to do that? Was it the information he gave them about where he was?
That's a great question.
Yes. Right after they conducted the raid of Kagan Klein's house back in 2017, he told them, or rather one of the Kagan shared that house with his father, Tony Klein. And one of the Kleins told authorities that we couldn't possibly have been involved in the murders because we were in Las Vegas at the time. And the law enforcement did not investigate and verify that statement as they should have. It turns out that the Kleins had indeed recently been in Las Vegas, but they did not leave for that trip until after the murders. And at the time of the murders, they were still in Peru, Indiana.
We also uncovered through sources that the FBI made one other pretty crucial mistake. They were supposed to obtain video footage from different local businesses on the day of the murders. And our understanding is that when investigators went back to look for footage of a certain gas station in Delphi, to look into it, because they found that through some means, Kagan Klein had some sort of search looking for that specific location. And they found that the FBI had not properly collected that footage and that it was therefore gone. So any sort of ability to say whether or not Klein or a vehicle or one of his associates were at that location at the time was hindered by this sort of mistake on the part of the FBI.
Yeah, because they can even prove he drove by there. A vehicle matching That's another piece of evidence. It's significant. A vehicle matching yours drove by there even is very damning in a small community.
And blows apart your alibi if you're saying, I've never even, I have not been there in years, well, here's your car.
Yeah. So more things have happened since then. I just wanted to mention that because we realized maybe a few years were shifted in a different direction. In the meantime, though, they did pinpoint down on this and spend some time doing this before we were aware.
Yeah. There's definitely been a lot of work behind the scenes. And I think that's something that we've been heartened by, because when law enforcement remains silent for so long, it creates an impression of like, well, are things just stalled out? What are they doing? And they can say, well, we're working hard on it. But it's another thing to actually know what sort of work they've been putting into it. And I think the fact that this is going on, and we can also speak briefly about, there's been an extensive water search up in Peru, Indiana, which of course is the same location that Kagan Klein lived in for years and grew up in. That was going on up until very recently, from mid-August onward. And you had about 12 or so Indiana State Police personnel searching the water. We don't know the results of that, but it's all very interesting that this is all happening.
Yeah, it leads you to believe they're looking. You can connect the dots and say, hey, they're looking for evidence. But
yeah,
I guess we don't know. But there's some other things you thought were interesting because I listened to all the episodes of your podcast. I love it. There were some others. Yeah, I can't, and we'll plug it all later because I have a heck of a lot of respect for you guys. But they've also, like, a helicopter. There's been a few other things that really could make you think like they're really focusing on this particular individual for this case. I could be wrong, but they're spending a lot of time focusing on this individual for something.
Yes, we have multiple sources. I think people sometimes get the impression that we have one source who's feeding us everything, but we have multiple sources confirming each other when they say that people are looking, in the investigation is looking at the Klein lead right now very strongly. And, I think a lot of the activity around the water search and certain visits by the superintendent to Miami County, Indiana, which is, of course, is where Peru is. I think all of that really indicates that and sort of proves out that at the very least, this is what they're focusing on right now. And if that changes, then our reporting will reflect that and say, actually, okay, they're moving on to this or that. But for the time being, and you can understand that given the fact that you have this, account that is talking with Libby and she wants to meet the person, and then the unthinkable happens.
Yeah. And it really just changes this really changed how we thought about what had happened. Because at first we're like social media. I'm saying the public. I'm not saying you or I. You could be led to believe at first it was definitely probably something with social media. They kept bringing up Snapchat. That could lead you to believe that. The second sketch is released, and then it almost picks up. Some people start thinking like, this just may have been a crime of opportunity, like not planned at all. So that shift happens. Then when we hear about this, if it's the case, it's definitely social media planned. Or I don't know about the murdering piece, but it was planned out, and social media played into it because that is still social media, what he was using. So there's been a lot of different, it's been a roller coaster ride, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I can see where the public's frustrated and they want to connect the dots, but I'll let you close out with where it's at right now and why it's important not to do that. And how you think people should approach this, because if you spend too much time thinking about all the things that we've talked about, it can really put you in a place of great confusion.
Yes, it gets very confusing, and also it can just be very depressing.
Yeah.
We released, as we said, that 190-page transcript of the police interview, and if you read that, there's a lot of disturbing and upsetting details in there about the nature of child sexual abuse. Right now, as Anya mentioned, they recently concluded a multi-week search of the Wabash River. And I guess it's fair to say that at this point, we're kind of in a holding pattern to try to figure out what the results of that search were, and if those results will lead to any further arrests or charges being filed.
Yes, we're still very much looking on the case. We don't want to ever publish something that's just for the sake of publishing something on Delphi. We feel like we only want to speak on it if we have something to add, whether that's new information, from news gathering, or new analysis that we can kind of give our opinions on. But, I think it's fair to say that we know from talking with people that a ton of work is going on behind the scenes, and that, there's no way to tell whether any big development is imminent. That all depends on so many factors. And, we're not going to be the ones knowing immediately about that. It's going to be, going through the investigation at first. But we would just encourage people to be very cautious about, believing or spreading rumors on social media, because, this is very much the reality that two families have been living in since 2017, and anything that kind of gets their hopes up or makes them feel like, something may be happening when it isn't, we shouldn't do that. We should, trust reputable news sources. We should, law enforcement will communicate, I think, with the public when they can. And we will continue to dig into it in the meantime. But we just would definitely urge caution, because there's been a couple of flare-ups where people kind of have said, oh, something's happening. And, it turned out not to be true. And it's just a good lesson for everybody that, it's better to be slow, cautious, get your facts straight than just, run with a rumor, sort of, I think, in our opinion.
I think regardless, it's in law enforcement's hands. Just to put it straightforward, that's who you got to rely on to solve this. I don't think any internet sleuth or anything is going to be the one at the end of the day. It's going to solve this. So at least I think maybe we now know that they're working on something, and that's why I really admire what you guys have done, because there's been some mistakes made by the people investigating this, without a doubt. But we know they're doing something, and we don't have a choice but to let them do what they're doing. There's nothing we could do in the meantime, but they are doing something.
Yes, well said. And yeah, we are always very much, sometimes people say things like, wow, you guys have done all this or found all this. And it's like, all we are doing is shining a mirror on what law enforcement's doing. We're not we're reporters. So we're not involved in the investigation. We are basically investigating the investigation so we can responsibly report on it for the public. One of our pet peeves is when true crime figures and podcasters and whatnot take credit for solving cases, when it's like, you didn't solve anything. The police solved it and you reported on it. So we're always very much saying, we're journalists. We're trying to, very much just get the facts right to the public. And that's how we view our role in this. And hopefully by doing that, we can minimize some of the sensationalism, the speculation, and also keep the public informed about a very important case that has certainly been, going on for years and people desperately want to see solved.
I'll let you I want you to explain where, if somebody does know something, they can reach out to, but then also where your guys' stuff is, because like you just said, you have a very serious, great approach to this. It's not for entertainment value, even though I do love Kevin's reading of the transcript. But no, we'll sum it up here with where they can have any tips or anything they can go, and then also to check out the stuff your guys doing, because I can't give you enough credit.
For anybody who has a tip for us or wants to reach out, our email is murdersheet@gmail.com. We're mostly off of a lot of social media nowadays because it's just too overwhelming. So email's definitely the way to go, because we definitely both check that. And if you get a lot of emojis and stuff, then it's me responding. And if you get a lot of more terse diction, then that's going to be Kevin. I don't really use that many emojis, maybe exclamation points, I would say, though. Now, otherwise, we're available on all podcast platforms. And so, you could just look up Murder Sheet and sort of get a sense there. And we label all the Delphi coverage as the Delphi murders. So people know if they're just mostly interested in that case, you can listen to those. And then we also do other coverage. We try to bring something a little bit new, whether it's an interview with a detective or a family member or an expert, or, new information that we uncover through reporting, to the cases we cover, or, analysis or whatnot. So we try to have a value add instead of just kind of, just rehashing the same thing that everyone else, rehashes, or like a Wikipedia page. So we try to put some work into it, but we're always looking for case suggestions. We used to focus more on restaurant murders, and we still do, but we also, we've kind of broadened our horizons a little bit, and we're always very interested in Indiana cases in particular because, this is where we live. And, we feel like, the kind of home state connection to that. And, there are unfortunately a lot of unsolved cases in Indiana. I don't have a percentage or anything or any stats to quote, but it always feels sort of like, wow, there's a lot of these.
So to end it off here, if somebody listening to this, and by the way, that's why I started this podcast, right? Because they have the same interest, various different things with this state. But if somebody listening to this has information or anything, who do they contact?
They should contact the Delphi Tip Line, which we will pull up the information for right now. But, we always are stressing to people that, we're not the police.
Exactly.
Tip the police first, and if you want to come to us and give us some information, we can talk. But if you feel like it's relevant to the current investigation, then, we strongly suggest you reach out. They get a lot of crank emails too. So, don't send them that. But if it's important, send it to them. You can email Abby and Libby tip at chrf.com, or you can call the tip line at 765-822-3535. And if you do have information, please do that. Thank you.
Both of you are doing great things, and I encourage everybody to, if you want to learn more about the case, or even like the Burger Chef, which hopefully we can link up and talk about that later in the season. But check out the stuff you're doing because it's great. So keep up the great work.
Thank you so much.
We really appreciate it, Jeff. And thank you so much for shining a spotlight on this case. It's very important to Indiana, and it's also just very important to people around the world because I think Abby and Libby's story really resonates with people and they want to see justice.
We want to have that for their family. Absolutely. Well, again, thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Jeff.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Indiana Stories. If you like what you heard, you can go to indianastories.com for more episodes and other stories related to Indiana. Also, if you're enjoying this podcast, there's several things you can follow: the podcast itself, the newsletter, and various other things. Thanks again for listening, and we will be back with another episode, and I hope you join us for another Indiana story.
And the question is, do I stay here? Will you be back? Are you gonna come back? Will you be back? Are you coming back?